Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza should go down in history as one of the darkest events in the 21st century. But there is already a desperate attempt among some of Israel's staunchest backers to rewrite their history. Mike Pompeo was director of the CIA in Donald Trump's first term.
The next generation of young people won't remember October 7th in the same way. That's true in Israel and in America and broadly in the world. And we need to make sure two things. One, it's not that we don't forget. We need to make sure that the story is told properly so that when the history books write this, they don't write about the victims of Gaza, right? They can't. The history, and it's. I should be a little more precise. There were victims in Gaza, right? It's true. There are civilian casualties in every war that's ever been fought, but the victims were the people of the nation-state of Israel. Though that the aggressor was the Iranian regime in the proxy of Hamas, and we need to make sure that the history books reflect that, and that requires each of us every day to talk about it in real time with our children, with our grandchildren, about it in a way that is serious and thoughtful and complete and moral.
We need to make sure that the story is told properly, so when the history books write this, they don't write about the victims of Gaza, he says. What a wild statement to make. To even admit that there are victims in Gaza, but they're just casualties that happen just because it's a war, because casualties happen, not at the same extent. Not when they're deliberately targeted, which we have ample, huge, overwhelming evidence for that to be the case. It is the totality of the opinion of genocide scholars that this is deliberate genocide committed by Israel against the Palestinian people. Netanyahu and Gallant indicted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court, a case at the ICJ against Israel for genocide. They have deliberately used this situation as an excuse to try and force the Gazans out of where they live. We've all heard the stories about the potential for them using Somaliland as a place to ethnically cleanse them to. We even had a Likud official, Avi Dichter, at the start of the conflict, say that they were carrying out the Gaza Nakba, i.e. to finish what they started in 1948, where they first ethnically cleansed Palestinians as part of the Zionist colonial project in 1948. There have been tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians killed during Israel's genocide in Gaza. Multiple October the 7th's worth of people, and every life lost is tragic. What we should understand is that the reality of this conflict is that everyone who's died is a casualty of Zionism. Everyone who's died in Gaza is a casualty of Israel's colonial project in the region. Their desire for more land, their desire for more influence, their desire to want to subjugate the Palestinian people, the political officials of Israel, the statecraft of Israel itself necessitates this forever conflict until they have maintained full control of what Likud would describe as Judea and Samaria. It is written into Likud's charter that between the river and the sea is only Israeli sovereignty, and as an ethno-state, it cannot countenance those borders containing too many Palestinians to dilute their ethnic majority. That is the reality of Zionism. This is why we're in this position. It was nothing to do, broadly, with this idea of wanting to fully defeat Hamas. And that's why so many civilians have died. It's why they deliberately ensured that they could manufacture a humanitarian catastrophe by controlling the food in and out of Gaza. Why else would they have done it, given we know that there was precious little evidence to suggest all of the lies about Hamas stealing food, for example, when you look at the work of people in the region who've been able to counteract those claims. These were the true victims who were sadistically attacked by the IDF, directed by people to shoot them with no regard for the lives of who they were. So all of us, we've seen the images on our phones. It will be burnt into my retinas for the rest of my days on this earth. All of the Gazans I've seen killed by the IDF. Those are the victims that will be written into the history books. And it will be another instance of what happens when you allow colonialism to expand with no checks, with no resistance to that occupation, that colonialism. As for the people left in Gaza, their future seems uncertain too. It was previously announced by the Trump administration that as part of a peace deal brokered by envoy Steve Witkoff between Israel and Hamas, there would be a so-called peace board tasked with overseeing the preliminary phase of Gaza's reconstruction. We had previously reported on Novara Live that former British Prime Minister and destroyer of the Middle East Tony Blair had been considered for the role by Donald Trump and his advisor Jared Kushner, and was backed to do so by the Palestinian Authority. However, this idea was quietly junked after fierce opposition from both Hamas and other Middle Eastern leaders over his involvement in the Iraq War. But where there's an interference in Arab affairs, a British Prime Minister isn't that far away, and this time it's a little closer to home. It was reported this week that the now formally titled National Committee for the Administration of Gaza is set to include sitting British Prime Minister Keir Starmer as one of its members, a man who only 2 years ago famously endorsed Israel's committing war crimes against the people who live in the enclave, live on LBC. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was quick to pour water over the committee, stating it is only a declarative move, and that Israel's goals of Hamas disarmament and the return of the remains of the final captive remain paramount, and there will still be IDF soldiers in Gaza. Dahlia, it seems like it doesn't matter whether it's choosing the story, choosing what the history looks like, or indeed choosing their own governance. The Palestinians never get to decide for themselves, do they?
We spoke about this last week in the context of Latin America, Venezuela more specifically. Sovereignty in the Middle East is structurally impossible within our current global order. It's not a matter of the decisions or the policies of individual governments. It goes far deeper than that, because much like Latin America, the Middle East is a geopolitically essential node of the global economy. You simply cannot be a dominant global economic player if you do not dominate the Middle East and Latin America, in a sense. Because firstly, where they are located geographically, Latin America is on the doorstep of the US. The Middle East and North Africa is the interface, the connective tissue between Asia, Africa, and Europe. These are both places whose trade routes are absolutely essential to the smooth functioning of global capitalism. We have tons of resources, oil, minerals in these regions, and also it's an important source of labor. So these kind of hotspots that we describe as being underdeveloped, or we describe as being, conflict prone, these are places that are structurally unable to achieve their own sovereignty, to decide their own fate. And also there's another element to that, which is that probably because of that position that they hold within a globalized economy, Latin America and the Middle East and Africa as well have been the site of some of the most successful, threatening, liberatory, anti-colonial socialist politics. You have pan-Arabism in the Middle East, pan-Africanism throughout Africa. You have anti-colonial struggles within Latin America. There is a long history and memory of fighting against imperialism, fighting against capitalism as well, and it's always been a potential hub of a socialist politics. And for that reason, there has always had to be a very, very ironclad grip on what happens in these regions. And that's why when I said earlier in the show about Iran, that it's not that the US and Europe don't want autocracy in Iran, they just want autocracy on their behalf. And that's what they currently have in a lot of the Middle East and North Africa. And that's how they want to keep it. And when you look at the role that Israel plays in that, why is the West so invested in Israel? Why is the West why Western politicians willing to risk their entire careers over support for Israel? Why are we willing to pour in millions and billions of pounds into the Israeli state when people in this country can't find somewhere to live? Like, what is it? It is precisely because in the 60s, when the West began to take an interest in Israel, it was because they were at the zenith of these post-colonial, Pan-African, Pan-Arab movements that were really creating a substantial threat in a way that was very comparable to, for example, the USSR, to a global capitalist system. And, it was a united movement. It was a movement that had a lot of flaws, a lot of issues, but fundamentally it was one of the most significant threats to the global capitalist order we have ever seen. And ever since then, the US and the West more broadly has needed a policeman on the ground in that region to ensure that they never get even remotely close to posing that kind of threat. Because they are so essential, that status of being essential is always at risk of being turned into power. And the investment in Israel, it's nothing to do with caring about the welfare or the well-being of the Jewish people, or believing in the self-determination of the Jewish people, or repenting for the Holocaust. It's nothing to do with that. It is about maintaining a policeman-style presence, a foot soldier, an entity within the region to ensure that their status of being essential to the functioning of global capitalism can never be turned into power. And Palestine, because Palestine is at the heart of the Israeli project, because of the religious and historic, the kind of religious ties to that land, Palestine is on the kind of knife edge of that. And there is always a sense that if Palestine is able to liberate itself whilst on the sharpest edge of Western and Zionist colonialism, then that's a domino whose effects cannot be predicted. That is, if they are able to be liberated from that status, then all the countries in the region will experience and could experience a similar transformation and pose that kind of potential threat that they posed in the post-imperial era, which was the last time where we saw a real, genuine conversation about what could the global political and economic principles of this world be run on. Is it on capitalism, or could it be on something else? The idea of that moment being repeated, especially at a moment right now where people are disaffected and there is a hunger for kind of a populist antagonism to the status quo. That is why the US and the West, despite everything, is doubling down on its support of Israel, and why they have to make sure that sovereignty in this region is never possible in any kind of meaningful form.